Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen in 1813, is one of the most popular novels in English literature. The story is set in the English countryside in the early 19th century and focuses on the Bennet family, particularly the second eldest daughter, Elizabeth Bennet. The novel explores themes of love, marriage, social class, and individual growth, with a strong emphasis on the tension between pride and prejudice, as suggested by the title. Chapter 1 to 5: The Bennet Family and the Arrival of Mr. Bingley. The story begins with the Bennet family, who live in the village of Longbourn. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 daughters: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. Mrs. Bennet's greatest desire is to see all her daughters married to wealthy men, as their family estate is entailed to a distant male cousin, meaning it cannot be inherited by any of the Bennet daughters. Excitement grows in the village when a wealthy young man, Mr. Charles Bingley, rents a nearby estate called Netherfield Park. Mr. Bingley is described as good-natured, handsome, and wealthy, making him an ideal match for any of the Bennet daughters. At a local ball, Mr. Bingley becomes immediately attracted to Jane Bennet, the eldest and most beautiful of the Bennet sisters. At the same event, Mr. Bingley is accompanied by his close friend, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Darcy is extremely wealthy, but appears proud and aloof, refusing to dance with Elizabeth Bennet when asked. This behavior causes Elizabeth to form a negative opinion of him, believing him to be arrogant and judgmental. Darcy's initial rejection of Elizabeth marks the beginning of the complex relationship between the two. Chapter 6 to 12: Jane and Bingley's growing attraction. Darcy's interest in Elizabeth. As Mr. Bingley and Jane spend more time together, it becomes clear that they are growing fond of each other. However, Jane's reserved and modest nature makes it difficult for others, including Bingley, to know the extent of her feelings. Meanwhile, Mr. Darcy, despite his initial coldness, begins to notice Elizabeth's intelligence, wit, and independent spirit. Though he finds himself drawn to her, his pride and the difference in their social status hold him back. During a visit to Netherfield to see Jane, who falls ill after a journey in the rain, Elizabeth stays with her sister, giving Darcy the opportunity to observe her more closely. Elizabeth, however, remains unimpressed with Darcy and continues to view him as conceited and unfriendly. Chapter 13 to 23: Mr. Collins' Proposal and the Wickham Scandal. Mr. William Collins, the Bennet family's heir, arrives for a visit. He is a clergyman and is described as pompous, self-important, and overly concerned with pleasing his wealthy benefactor, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. His main purpose for visiting is to find a wife among the Bennet sisters, and he sets his sights on Elizabeth. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, but she rejects him, despite her mother's pressure to accept. This refusal shocks Mrs. Bennet, as Collins is a potential provider for the family. However, Elizabeth's father supports her decision, valuing her happiness over a practical but loveless marriage. During this time, Elizabeth also meets Mr. George Wickham, a charming and handsome officer in the militia. Wickham tells Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy wronged him in the past by denying him a position and inheritance promised by Darcy's late father. Elizabeth, already predisposed to dislike Darcy, believes Wickham's story and feels even more resentment toward Darcy. Shortly after Elizabeth rejects Collins, he proposes to her friend Charlotte Lucas, who accepts. Though Charlotte does not love Mr. Collins, she views the marriage as a practical arrangement that will provide her with security. Chapter 24 to 35: Darcy's Proposal and Elizabeth's Rejection. As Elizabeth visits Charlotte and Mr. Collins at their new home, she is introduced to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who happens to be Darcy's aunt. Lady Catherine is condescending and controlling, but during Elizabeth's stay, Darcy visits his aunt and becomes increasingly captivated by Elizabeth's character. Eventually, Darcy surprises Elizabeth by proposing marriage. However, his proposal is far from romantic. He focuses on how unsuitable the match is due to her lower social standing and how he has struggled to overcome his attraction to her. Offended by his arrogance, Elizabeth refuses Darcy's proposal. She also accuses him of separating Jane and Bingley, as well as mistreating Wickham. Shocked by her rejection, Darcy writes Elizabeth a letter to explain his actions. In the letter, he admits to separating Jane and Bingley, but only because he believed Jane did not truly care for Bingley and was only interested in his wealth. Regarding Wickham, Darcy reveals that Wickham is not a victim, but a manipulative man who tried to elope with Darcy's younger sister, Georgiana, to gain access to her fortune. Elizabeth is deeply affected by Darcy's letter, realizing she may have misjudged him. While her opinion of Darcy softens, she continues to reflect on the complexities of his character. Chapter 36 to 45, Elizabeth's visit to Pemberley and the Wickham-Lydia scandal. After some time, Elizabeth visits Darcy's estate, Pemberley, while traveling with her aunt and uncle, the Gardiners. Darcy is away during their visit, and Elizabeth is impressed by the grandeur and beauty of the estate. She also hears from Darcy's servants that he is a kind and generous master, which further alters her perception of him. Unexpectedly, Darcy returns home during their visit and behaves with great politeness and warmth toward Elizabeth and her relatives. His manners have greatly improved since his initial proposal, and Elizabeth begins to see him in a new light. Darcy even introduces Elizabeth to his sister, Georgiana, and they get along well. However, just as Elizabeth's feelings toward Darcy are starting to change, she receives troubling news from home. Her youngest sister, Lydia, has run away with Mr. Wickham. The scandal threatens to ruin the Bennet family's reputation, as an unmarried woman running away with a man could lead to social disgrace. Elizabeth returns home immediately, fearing the worst. Chapter 46 to 50, Darcy's intervention and Lydia's marriage. Elizabeth is devastated by Lydia's reckless behavior, but surprisingly, the situation is resolved when Wickham and Lydia marry. Initially, it appears that Mr. Gardiner, Elizabeth's uncle, has arranged the marriage by paying off Wickham's debts. However, Elizabeth soon learns that Darcy was the one who quietly intervened, convincing Wickham to marry Lydia and providing financial support for the arrangement. Darcy's actions astonish Elizabeth. She realizes that he has gone to great lengths to protect her family from scandal, despite the damage to his own reputation. This selfless act leads Elizabeth to reconsider her earlier judgments of Darcy. Chapter 51 to 61, Jane and Bingley's engagement, Darcy's second proposal. With the scandal resolved, Mr. Bingley returns to Netherfield and rekindles his relationship with Jane. This time, without Darcy's interference, Bingley proposes to Jane, and she happily accepts. The Bennet family is overjoyed, as Jane's marriage to a wealthy man secures the family's future. Meanwhile, Lady Catherine de Bourgh hears rumors that Darcy might propose to Elizabeth again. Outraged, she confronts Elizabeth and tries to intimidate her into promising never to accept Darcy's proposal. However, Elizabeth stands her ground and refuses to make any such promise. Darcy, moved by Elizabeth's integrity and affection for her family, proposes again. This time, Elizabeth accepts, having come to recognize Darcy's true character and feeling deep affection for him. Their engagement is met with some surprise, but eventually, both families come to accept it. Conclusion: the happily ever after. The novel concludes with two happy marriages, Jane and Bingley, and Elizabeth and Darcy. Elizabeth's marriage to Darcy is not only based on love, but mutual respect and understanding, showcasing the importance of overcoming both pride and prejudice in relationships. Darcy's initial pride and Elizabeth's initial prejudice against him both dissolve as they learn to see each other's true worth. Through these characters, Austen critiques the societal expectations of marriage, class, and wealth in her time, while also celebrating the transformative power of love and personal growth. Pride and Prejudice remains a timeless story that resonates with readers for its wit, romance, and keen observations on human behavior. This summary provides an overview of the major events and themes of Pride and Prejudice, focusing on the central relationship between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, while also exploring the secondary characters and subplots.